Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking. And Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things and to a living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In the past generation, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave you without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. But Jews came down from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. When they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue on in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. This might make it a little difficult to drink. Okay, we're going to start today with an interview. So Ben, do you want to come up? Have we got the handheld mic? So I'm going to interview Ben quickly, and then we'll look at how this applies to our situation. So first of all, Ben, what's your name?
Ben.
Perfect. Well, I better get my questions up. Okay, so Ben called Ben. Can you just tell everyone who you are in case people haven't met you before?
Yeah, my name's Ben.
Copy that bit.
I'm married to Emily, and been coming to the church for the last sort of year and a bit, and originally from up in sunny Cumbria on the west coast.
Brilliant. So we're going to be talking today about sharing the gospel. So what context have you had the opportunity to share the gospel in?
Yeah, so different sort of contexts in terms of, being at work, sharing maybe why I believe in the gospel, why I believe in God, which sometimes I think can lead to sort of surprise looks where they're like, "Oh no, but like I thought you were clever," and then also doing. I don't have much experience with it, but recently started going out with Andy and Matt and some others, doing some evangelism sort of out in the town, talking with strangers and asking them sort of simple, non-confrontational questions to kind of get them thinking about God and Jesus.
Cool. Okay. So we're on to the quick fire round now. Feel free to hold the microphone nice and close so everyone gets this.
Yeah.
Do you believe that nature and creation demonstrate the existence of God and his goodness?
Yes.
Okay. Do the prophets and history and science and logic all confirm the gospel?
Yes.
Has God clearly revealed himself to mankind in Jesus?
Yes.
Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10, how rock solid would you say the gospel is?
I'd say it's a 10 in that it's sort of more reliable than I am to think about it.
Okay, so the gospel is pretty rock solid. Would you say that the gospel is good or bad news for people?
I think it's good news for people in that sort of. I think you see a lot of people that are very sort of lost and you know they're trying to sort of strive for things, and then you see other people that have managed to achieve those things and they're still not fulfilled or happy in any way. So it's kind of I think you know for a lot of people they might you know, have a different goal in their mind, but actually you know this is sort of the good news that people need.
Nice. Okay, so we've covered that the gospel makes sense, it's rock solid, and it's really good news for people. So in your experience, when you shared the gospel with people, everyone that you've told about it has turned straight to God, right?
I haven't quite got that success rate yet. But no, I think often people sort of instinctively will try and find reasons to reject it, whether that be sometimes it's just kind of that it's incompatible with their lifestyle, and so they will sort of compare, you know, oh, but what about me because I do this thing, so therefore, you know, if I were to become Christian, then I would have to sort of give up this part of my life that I'm sort of not willing to. So, when obviously that's not something that necessarily affects how true something is. You know, I could decide that like I wasn't really in a position to pay my taxes and it's not really working for me, but it doesn't make them less true or less there.
For sure. All right, well, that's everything, Ben. Thanks for sharing that with us. It's good to hear a bit about your experience. Give a round of applause for Ben. So I'm sure everyone who is listening to that will be in a similar position to me, where actually it's not that surprising that people aren't all giving their lives to Christ the moment they hear the gospel. I'm assuming everyone's had the same experience, that we've shared the gospel with people, our friends, people we've met, whoever it might be, and the majority response from people is that they're not interested, they reject it. Either they say they don't want to hear it, or they explain it away for other reasons. In whatever way, people tend to reject the gospel. Why? I want us to consider that question. Why? Why do people reject the gospel if it makes so much sense, and if it's so good, and it's so obviously true? Then why do people reject it? Is it because of Ben? Is it that Ben is not persuasive enough? Or is it that we're not persuasive enough? Is it maybe that we're not flashy or exciting enough in our presentation? Maybe we don't have cool enough supernatural ministries. Maybe we should start a school of supernatural ministry in Preston, right? Have some really cool supernatural experiences. Is it that maybe we're not good enough Christians? Is it that people aren't interested because they see us? We're not good enough to share the gospel, it's not effective. Why do people reject it? Well, sometimes I'm tempted to think maybe if I was more of these cool things that people would accept the gospel more. Sometimes it's tempting to think that maybe if I was a bit more like the Apostle Paul, then everyone would instantly turn to God after hearing me share the gospel. Well, in verse 8, the apostles Paul and Barnabas turn up at Lystra. And in this city, it was full of pagans. They worshipped Zeus. At the gates of the city, there was the temple to Zeus. And that's significant because basically the meaning is that this city is Zeus's. He's the protector, the god of this city. And all the people there worship him. And Paul and Barnabas start preaching the gospel to the people. Now, Paul and Barnabas aren't any old guys. They're apostles, commissioned directly by Jesus himself appearing to them. We know from what we've already been reading Acts, these guys are fantastic teachers. They've been serving the church. They've been sent out on missions by the church. They're off on a missionary journey now, preaching the gospel to lots of people in lots of areas. They're experienced. They know their stuff. They've got great gospel presentation. Not only that, but as they're there sharing the gospel, preaching it to people, the Holy Spirit heals a man through Paul. A guy that everyone in the community knows was a cripple from birth. There is no way this guy walks. And he gets up and walks. Confirmation that the power of the God is with the gospel. Surely people will turn to God. Surely, right? There's no reason not to. But they reject the gospel. In fact, they not only reject the gospel, but they try to replace it with their own idolatry. The very men that are telling them that Zeus and Hermes are false idols, that are vain, are worthless, they're trying to say are Zeus and Hermes and worship them as those people. It doesn't make sense. The people are amazed at what God is doing through Paul and Barnabas, yet they reject the very message that Paul and Barnabas are bringing. Paul cries out in anguish, "Why are you doing these things? Why are you rejecting the gospel and replacing it with idolatry?" This is the same question that we've been asking ourselves. Why are people rejecting the gospel? It doesn't make sense. As we read on, Paul preaches to them again. He calls them to turn from their vain idols to the living God. He helpfully points out that actually their entire lives, and for the lives of their ancestors, God has made his existence known. He's made his character known to them through nature, through providing for them, giving them rains for crops, giving them fruitful seasons, harvests, satisfying them with food, making their hearts glad. These people have not been without witness. They've known the goodness of God. They've known that he exists. It's plain in creation. Everyone can see it. All of creation testifies to God and his goodness. Surely now they'll turn from their false idols. Surely now they'll give it up and go, "Okay, sorry, we were confused there for a moment. But sure, we've seen what you've done. Yeah, we think this is amazing. We've listened to the words you're saying. Obviously, you're not Zeus and Hermes because you're preaching another god to us and saying they're worthless. Yeah, we see it in all of creation. Surely now they'll turn to Jesus." But no, they're barely held back from sacrificing right then and there. This is not people who go, "Oh yeah, no, you're right. I see it now, it's rubbish." These are people, they're there with the knife and the ox. They're there with the garlands. They barely hold themselves back from sacrificing. They want to find a way to twist this around to say that these guys are Zeus and Hermes. These guys are our pagan idols. They're desperate to find a way to reject the gospel. In fact, they're so desperate that seeing as they can't turn the gospel into idolatry, they take the first opportunity to destroy it in another way. Jews come down from Iconium and Antioch, and they team up with these Jews. Now, this is very surprising, actually, because these guys are like religiously natural enemies, right? They believe completely different things. I mean, the first expectation is not surely that the Jews would team up with the pagans rather than the ones who are saying, yeah, Judaism is true and it's been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. But the Jews are coming to destroy the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they team up with the pagans, and the pagans go, yeah, rather than believing all we've just heard, instead we'd rather team up with these Jews who we don't agree with at all. We don't believe anything they say to us, but right now we're going to believe exactly what they're saying. Let's team up together. Let's kill these guys. And it seems crazy when you read it, right? In verse 18, they can barely restrain themselves from sacrificing to these two guys. They can't contain themselves of wanting to worship Paul and Barnabas. And in verse 19, they suddenly decide they want to kill them. It doesn't add up. There's no logical reasoning that would follow through there. They drag Paul out, they stone him to the point where they thought he was dead. That guy was messed up, dragged outside the city, left for dead. If you're with me here in thinking that their minds don't sound logical, that it doesn't sound like they're rational thinkers here, that something crazy is going on in their heads and their hearts, well, let's read Romans chapter 1, verse 18 to find out what it is that's going on there. The Bible tells us this. For the wrath of God is revealed from heavens against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they're without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honour him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, exchanging the glory of God, of the immortal God, for images resembling mortal man, and birds and animals and creeping things. That sound familiar? Yeah, it does. It's pretty much exactly describing the situation here. They've been able to perceive God clearly from the beginning of time. Their ancestors, them, they see him in nature, in creation, and all that's been provided for them. Yet in their foolish minds, they're rejecting it and turning to vain things, created idols and men, literally men here, Paul and Barnabas, mere men. As we read in verse 18, that by their unrighteousness, they suppress the truth. And this is really important here, because this explains what we're reading about. These are not people who are coming and looking at the facts and going, okay, let's work this through scientifically or religiously, and let's come to the correct conclusion here. They're people who are coming to the facts, who are coming to the gospel and what they're seeing, not with a clear, rational mind, but a mind that is actively suppressing the truth. Actively suppressing the truth of the gospel. Suppressing it by trying to write it off as idolatry. Suppressing it by changing the truth to be about worthless human things. Suppressing it with violence. Trying to drag the gospel out of the city and stone it by killing Paul. Active rejection. Romans 1 is not just describing the people of Lystra. Romans was written by Paul, actually, the same guy who was stoned in our story. And when Paul's writing this, he's describing every person who has not turned to Jesus. Everyone who doesn't place their faith in Jesus. It's describing the people of Preston as well. The people who we're talking to on the streets when we go out and do evangelism. The people who we're talking to at work when we go and sit in our jobs, our friends, anyone who we meet, the people who our mission it is to reach in the city are being described in Romans 1 here. Not people who are just going to be convinced purely by rational thinking, purely by the facts and the evidence, but people who are actively suppressing the truth in their unrighteousness and their sin. So it kind of starts to add up, doesn't it? Ben's interview. Why people are rejecting the gospel. Does that sound familiar? Do you remember Ben's friend who said, what did your friend say? Oh, he's a bit of an idiot on that Jesus stuff, something like that. I've had friends who describe me as, oh yeah, he's mostly all right, but he's a bit of an idiot when it comes to that Jesus stuff. I've been there as well. I've heard that before. Actually, Ben is not a failure for sharing the gospel for any of the reasons that we've been considering about, not being cool enough or articulate enough. He's not a failure in sharing the gospel. Actually, the reason people are rejecting it is not just because of the way Ben's sharing it, but because of their minds hardened against their truth, their hearts hardened against the gospel. I need a little table for that. We are sharing, the truth is, guys, we are sharing the gospel with a world who's actively against it. We're sharing the gospel with a world who does not want to hear it. A world that is living in their own ways, that is loving their own little gods, their own little idols. In Preston, we've not got a temple to Zeus. It's kind of more difficult to see. If there was a big temple to Zeus, it'd be really easy to point and go, look, there's the idol of Preston. Here's what we're up against. Here's what people are loving and making their lives about. This worthless thing. It's a little more difficult to see in Preston in that day and age, but everyone who's not loving Jesus is turned to an idol. Everyone who's not worshipping him is worshipping something. And they're replacing the gospel with it. And before we become too puffed up and conceited, let me remind us that also this verse was describing every one of us. None of us were born loving Jesus. None of us came out of the womb praising him. All of us were born in sin. And all of us at one point were suppressing the truth. All of us at one point were rejecting Jesus. Every single one of us here today. So how did we turn to him? How did we become Christians? Let's read together Ezekiel chapter 6. In Ezekiel chapter 6, God is speaking through Isaiah. Verses 26 and 27. And I will give you a heart. And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. Guys, the only reason that we turned to God and accepted the gospel is not because out of our own goodness and our own desire to chase after God and to seek him and hunt him down and find him. Actually, we were rejecting the truth, and our hearts, as it says in Ezekiel 36, were of stone. Completely cold and dead in our trespasses and our sin. It was God himself who took out our heart of stone and replaced it with a heart of flesh. It was God who put his spirit within us. There is no way by our own power we are able to take out our own hearts and replace it. We didn't even want to. We hated that. We were running away from it to idols. There's no way that we could have made the spirit move in our hearts, but God stepped in and put his spirit in us. And that is the hope for the people of Preston. That is the beautiful grace of the gospel, that if people like you and me could be made new, people like you and me who hated God in rebellion against him could be made new by his spirit, then so can the people who we are sharing the gospel with. But that doesn't change the fact that right now they're living in rejection of him, and it's a daunting task. So we're going to spend the rest of this time looking at Paul and what he does. How do we share the gospel with the people who are set against it? And I've sort of drawn out 3 examples here in this section that we've read about how Paul shares the gospel with people set against it. So, number 1, Paul actively seeks out opportunities to share the gospel. Paul is not still sat in Antioch. Paul is not still sat in Tarsus or Jerusalem or wherever he's been sat comfortably before. He's out on a missionary journey. He's travelling out to places where they've not heard the gospel before, they've not heard it extensively before, and he's breaking new ground. He's seeking out people who haven't heard the gospel to share it with them. Why is this important? Well, because if it's true that people's hearts are set against God, their hearts of stone want to suppress the truth, then why would we expect them to go on a journey to seek out Paul to hear the gospel? People who hate the gospel are not going to want to come to you and ask you, hey, tell me about the gospel. I'd love to hear about that. Now, sure, there are times where God goes to work in people and draws them to us. And we're occasionally blessed with these conversations where people come asking about the gospel. Wonderful. But the Bible does not set that as the general expectation that people are going to want to come and seek out the gospel. It sets the expectation that they're naturally in rejection of it. And so we can't just hang around and sit here on a Sunday and wait for people to come. Because if they're going to do that, let me tell you, there'd be more people here this morning. We wouldn't just have us here, but all of Preston would be coming to hear the gospel preached. That's why we need to be active in making opportunities and going and finding people. Now, this might seem a bit scary. We might not be used to seeking out opportunities to share the gospel. But let me encourage you that we're here together as a church on this mission. We're not just individual people off in our business having to make this work ourselves, but we can work together as a church. And within our church, we've got lots of opportunities to work together to witness to people. Now, one of the ways that we've discussed this morning and Ben spoke about is we do evangelism on the streets about once a month. The reason we do that is not because we want to stand out on Preston High Street and have everyone look at us, but actually we recognise that if we don't go and do that, we're only going to reach the people that we make friends with, the people that we know, a certain small group of people who are already connected with Preston. If we want the gospel to reach the masses of Preston, if we want the gospel to be available to everyone, we've got to go out there and put it out there to people. If that's something you want to join in with, come and talk to me or Ben. You can get involved. You can invite people to church events. Have you ever wondered why we do events like the Christmas meal? Well, sure, one reason is that it's great to spend time together, encourage one another, build our friendships up. But actually, the reason we put on so many events, and a lot of them involve food and eating together, is because we want to make opportunities for people to come amongst our community. We want to make opportunities for people to join in with us, get to know us, and spend time with us, a community of people who love Jesus and want to share the gospel with them. If you have a friend who you want to witness to, the burden does not rely solely on you to share the gospel with them. But you've got the opportunity to invite them along to the stuff we do at church so that they become friends with 10, 15, 20 people who also love Jesus and want to share the gospel. You can start your own church event, a coffee morning, a food night, whatever it is that you can invite people along to. You can invite your friends to small groups. You can invite people to church itself. You know, if you're bringing people into church and inviting them to be with us on Sunday mornings, you're sharing the gospel with them. Because every morning at church, we preach the gospel through the songs that we sing, from the pulpit. And if you're bringing people into that, then you're witnessing to them. But we must take the initiative with people. We must take the initiative with our friends to share the gospel with them, because we cannot expect them to come asking us about it. I've considered this with my friends, actually. I've had some friends who I've spent years with at university, for example. I was at university for 5 years. It took me that long to get through my degree. And I was friends with some people who never once asked me about church, never once asked me about Jesus or the gospel. And it occurred to me that I could go a lifetime knowing someone and they would never stop and ask me what I believe about Jesus. Okay, lesson number 2. Paul carefully adapts his gospel presentation to the audience. Now, the section that we've just read in Acts chapter 14, Luke presents very carefully to us. And you may or you may not have noticed this, but in Acts chapter 14, the story that we've just read, Luke is making an allusion to Acts chapter 3. Now, I want to encourage you guys, please go away this week and read both of them. Get out Acts chapter 3, get out Acts chapter 14, and compare the two. See how many similarities you can find. The stories are very close to one another. And Luke is specifically telling them in a way where as we read Acts chapter 14, it draws Acts chapter 3 up in our memory. He wants us to see the comparison between the two. You see, in Acts chapter 3, Peter is sharing the gospel to the Jews. He also, the Holy Spirit also heals someone through Peter. And the crowds also turn and go, wow, Peter just healed someone. And Peter goes, no, that was God healing him through me. The power is in the gospel, in Jesus, not in me. And he also preaches the gospel. He also calls people to turn from their sin and turn to Jesus. And Luke here is showing us that the same gospel that was for the Jews is also for the Gentiles. He's building upon his theme here of the gospel first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. And he wants us to know that it's the very same gospel. Turn from your sin, turn from idolatry, and turn to the true and living God. Now, these stories have a lot of similarities, but there's one part which is clearly distinct between the two that I believe Luke wants to draw our attention to. And that's the way in which Paul and Peter share the gospel with these two groups of people. You see, when Peter goes to share the gospel with the Jews, he starts by talking to them about the Jewish tradition. He starts talking to them about their heritage, about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That's his starting point for sharing the gospel. But when Paul shares the gospel here with the pagans, he doesn't start with Jewish heritage. These pagans have got no idea about Jewish heritage. Instead, he starts with concepts that they understand: nature, creation, rains, and harvest. But let me be very clear. He shares the very same gospel. The message is the same. Turn from sin and idolatry. Turn to the true and living God. The message is the same, but he takes care to consider his audience and present it to them in a way that they will understand, that makes sense to them. Both Peter and Paul meet people where they're at. And that's something that we can learn from. You see, it's not just for us to go out and stand on the high street, or to go to our friends and say things in a way that makes sense to us, or not consider it, or just go all guns blazing, blasé, whatever it is. But actually, we want to be bold with the gospel in careful, diligent consideration of how is the best way we can share this. And that's why we take a lot of care in our church to carefully consider our evangelism strategies. That's why we build up this whole host of meetings and opportunities for people to join in with us. That's why we structure small groups in a way that any week you want to bring a friend along to that small group who might not get what we're doing if we're just having a prayer meeting, then you can let the small group leader know. And we will scrap what we were doing that week and do something that will be more welcoming and suitable for them. Not in a way that we change the gospel and go, okay, let's not speak about Jesus, but in a way that we make Jesus more clear and apparent to the people coming in among us. Peter and Paul never edit the gospel to make it more palatable. They only tailor their presentation. So let us diligently consider our audience and prepare to best present the gospel to them. Finally, Paul perseveres despite rejection and persecution. This is about as clear an example of persecution as we get, isn't it? He's stoned within an inch of death. His stoning was so bloody and brutal that they actually thought he was dead. What does Paul do? He gets up and the very next day he continues with his mission. He continues to go on and preach the gospel the very next day. Now, that doesn't seem on the surface like it makes sense, right? He's stoned with an inch of death, and the next moment he's getting up and walking on to preach the gospel again. Sure, I believe God miraculously intervenes there. He preserved Paul's life. He gave him strength. He gave him boldness. He gave him the strength he needed to carry on preaching the gospel. But Paul was still stoned with an inch of his life. And he still very easily could have gone, do you know what? This is not for me. This is way too dangerous. There is way too much persecution here. This is way too painful. It's not worth it. I'll be far more comfortable sat at home letting someone else do the mission. This is not for me. No, he gets up and he carries on. Guys, we've got to expect rejection. We cannot expect that every time we go to share the gospel, people will be loving it and love and listen to us. We will be rejected. We should even be prepared for persecution. Now, persecution for us might look differently in Preston to what we saw there. It's very unlikely that if we go out and share the gospel, we're going to get stoned within an inch of our life. But persecution can happen in many ways, and it's something that we should be ready for. But we cannot let rejection and persecution dissuade us with our mission to share the gospel, to share that precious, precious grace that we have been given by Jesus. Brothers and sisters, the gospel is way too beautiful to keep under wraps. It is way too important. If we don't share the gospel with people in Preston, how will they hear it and how will they turn to God? When we do experience rejection and persecution, let's respond in the way that they did in Acts chapter 5. Rejoice that we are counted worthy to suffer dishonour for the name of Jesus and get up and carry on. Let's act like Paul did in Acts chapter 14. Let's pick ourselves up and carry on with the gospel, pressing on to share the beautiful gospel of Jesus Christ. Take courage, for the day is drawing near where Jesus will return and we will meet him face to face. The day is drawing near. All of our afflictions, all of our pain and suffering will pass like a blink of an eye in the face of an eternity with him. And we have the opportunity to share the gospel with people and bring more and more people into the family of God, to know him, to experience the grace of God, to take on the righteousness of Jesus, and also join us in eternity, praising the Father. Take courage and preach the gospel with boldness. Yeah, Father, thank you for Acts chapter 14. Thank you for the encouragements we find here in Paul and Barnabas' ministry. I pray that you'll fill us with courage. I pray that you'll fill us with boldness. I pray that you'll fill us with a burning passion for your gospel. I pray that not one of us will be able to sit restless on our bums at home, but we'll all be filled with a zeal for your name and proclaiming it. Father, we thank you that you will always give us the words to say, and we thank you that by your Spirit you will make hearts new again. We thank you that your Spirit will blow in the hearts and minds of people. Thank you, Jesus, for the power of the gospel.